Good evening, you're watching Trending Tonight with me, Sanket Upadhyay. So whenever there is a change that exists right now in Afghanistan, there is a lot of impact. There is a human impact, a human tragedy that we are seeing unfolding in Afghanistan. There is an impact which is international in nature, there is a diplomatic impact, and there is an impact in the neighborhood. We are in fact going to talk about the last. The impact on the neighborhood, the impact on India. Afghanistan and the India impact of the Taliban takeover is going to be our top focus right here on this show. Before we move any further, here's Vishnu explaining.
India's interest in Afghanistan directly linked to a lot of investment projects. Let's give you a couple of ideas. Now, 34 of Afghanistan's provinces have an Indian involvement. The 42-megawatt Salma Dam in the Herat province, the 218-kilometer long Zarans-Dilaram highway built by the Border Roads Organization, the Afghan Parliament in Kabul built by India at a whopping cost of $90 million, a tripartite agreement for restoration of the Store Palace in Kabul, a 220-kilowatt DC transmission line from Pule-Khumri to the north of Kabul. Indian contractors and workers have restored telecommunications infrastructure in many provinces of Afghanistan. India has reconstructed a children's hospital it had helped build in Kabul in 1972. We've gifted 400 buses, 200 minibuses for urban transportation, 105 utility vehicles for municipalities, 285 military vehicles for the army. India has contributed desks for schools. We've built solar panels in remote villages. We've sent 75,000 tons of wheat to strengthen food security during the pandemic. We've signed an agreement for the construction of the Shatut Dam in the Kabul district and have pledged $1 million for another Aga Khan heritage project. India-Afghanistan trade grew with the establishment of an air freight corridor. The External Affairs Ministry says India's development portfolio in Afghanistan mounts to over $3 billion US.
All right, joining us right now is Aisha Tanzim, war correspondent, VOA Bureau Chief for Afghanistan as well as Pakistan. Thank you very much, Aisha, for joining us. My first question to you is, in your view, since you have extensively covered this entire region, what do you think is the likelihood of violence and instability existing in this region? I mean, the Taliban does say that the transition will be smooth and peaceful, but the point is, Taliban remains what it is. They may say that, it's an organization which has changed. I don't understand this term called good Taliban, but what in your wisdom or in your view is likely to happen?
Honestly, your guess is just as good as mine. I can only tell you what I saw and what we are reporting, which is so far we have heard, at least in Kabul, we have not heard reports of violence or anything else. But also, this is very new in Kabul. It's only day 2, and Taliban did not even enter the city until last night. So today, you can call as day 1 of the Taliban in Kabul. The city is almost under a lockdown. All shops, all malls, all offices, everything is closed. So very little traffic on the streets. There are Taliban checkpoints. We saw traffic going through the checkpoints and they seemed to not be stopping it. Around the airport, the situation was really bad. We saw the Taliban trying to crowd control with batons and pushing people back from the airport, but also using their Kalashnikovs. They're on the streets of Kabul almost everywhere. You see them, their presence, you can't miss it. And they're walking around with their Kalashnikovs, riding motorcycles, riding trucks. People in the city are waiting and watching with bated breath. Some of them are partially thankful that there was no attack and there was no war, which would have killed thousands of innocent civilians. But the other part, the other part of the population, the progressives, the women, the minorities, the Hazaras, they're in their houses. They're not getting out. They're waiting and watching. They have seen those Taliban statements promising, amnesty, promising no revenge killing, promising women's rights and human rights. But they're waiting and watching and they're not 100% sure that the Taliban roaming around the streets will stick to what's coming out of the senior leadership in Doha. And which is why you see that rush on the airport. You see thousands of people inside the airport literally living on the tarmac, and then thousands of people surrounding the airport trying to get out. A lot of people are trying to get out. A lot of other people have no visas. Some of them have no passports. And in these days, COVID restrictions have also limited their travel. So really an uncertain situation. Afghans are watching with bated breath. Hazaras are really worried. Progressive women's rights activists, you know, artists, painters, etc., very worried, not exactly sure what's going to happen.
Aisha,
Taliban...
Yeah, you must have spoken to a lot of these people who must have expressed their concern. What really is fueling this, this exodus, according to you? Despite this appeal by the Taliban that they're going to make things peaceful, the transition will be peaceful, why then still don't people trust?
A history. I mean, they've seen the 90s, and for the last 20 years, the Afghan government has been at war with Taliban. So they have not seen yet a peaceful Taliban rule. However, we do hear the statements that these are different than the 90s. In the 90s, we did not see Taliban issue statements claiming to respect human rights and women's rights and saying that they will not go on revenge killings. In fact, in the 90s, there was quite a bit of violence. This time we saw far less violence in the taking over of Afghanistan. A lot of places, the Afghan forces either just surrendered or retreated. So this is a Taliban that people have not experienced yet, and they have heard stories about it. You remember, a lot of Afghans are very young. They were kids when Taliban were ousted. So they have heard stories about Taliban from their mothers, from their fathers, from their uncles, their families in general. So they have not come face to face with this new cadre of Taliban, and they're not sure how they will react. Plus, I mean, there are several parts of it. There's the Doha branch who are more worldly wise, more savvy. They interact with the international community. And then there are these fighters who belong to small villages a lot of times in Afghanistan, and probably because they were fighting with the forces, could not visit a city because they were on a radar. So nobody knows whether there's that kind of discipline in this group, and whether the
I think that's a very, very important point. I think, Aisha, that point that you have mentioned, nobody knows whether they will have the discipline that they so claim, which is really the big reason. And of course, people haven't forgotten history. Aisha, thank you very much for joining us right here on NDTV. I would like to introduce Mrs. Zorawar Daulat Singh, author and strategic affairs analyst. Mr. Brahma Chelani is a security expert now with us. Meera Shankar, a former diplomat, and Lieutenant General Syed Ata Hasnain, former GOC 15 Corps. Thank you very much to all of you all. We'll first begin with you, Mr. Chelani. How convinced are you, or what comes to your mind when you hear people use the term good Taliban? The fact that this is a changed Taliban, different Taliban, what comes to your mind?
Well, first, let's bear in mind that what has unfolded is the terrorist takeover of Afghanistan.
Correct.
And the geopolitical implications of the US defeat and humiliation in Afghanistan are much more significant globally than the American defeat in Vietnam. The Taliban's recapture of power will energize and embolden terrorist groups in the global jihadist movement. And the reconstituted extremist emirate in Afghanistan will not only provide sanctuary to Al-Qaeda, ISIS, and Pakistan-reared groups like Lashkar-e-Toiba and Jaish-e-Mohammed, it will actually deliver the rebirth of global terror. And if you look at the history since the Taliban was created by Pakistan in the mid-1990s, that history shows that jihadist terror in Afghanistan doesn't stay confined to Afghanistan, but rather spills over to India, Europe, and the US. When the Taliban was in power previously, from 1996 to 2001, their promotion of jihadism came to haunt India's security. The Taliban and Pakistan were complicit in the hijacking of flight IC-814 to Kandahar in 1999, and they were also complicit in the training on Afghan soil of Pakistan-reared terrorists to carry out attacks in India. So given that background, the Taliban's recapture of power is very bad news for Indian security. It poses a serious challenge to national security. And given the fact that India has no geographic contiguity with Afghanistan, India has no good options. So given the situation that is prevailing, it's a very fluid situation, rapidly changing. We do not know whether there will be resistance to Taliban rule. So at the moment, India has to wait and watch. It has to ensure the safety of Indians in Afghanistan, and it has to ensure that it does not undertake anything that exacerbates its security challenges. Because in the recent past, India has done things which have come to haunt its own security. For example, India blessed the US-Taliban deal in Doha, which was signed in February last year. Now that deal paved the way for the terrorist capture of Afghanistan.
Okay. Yes. Mr. Singh, I want to come to you now. You see, India has invested extensively in Afghanistan, in rebuilding Afghanistan. We built the parliament, lots of investments that have gone into creating Afghanistan again, or rebuilding Afghanistan again. Do you feel that two countries who have not lowered diplomatic ties or have not emptied their embassies, China as well as Pakistan, on the contrary, they are saying we will engage actively with the Taliban. Do you think that these two countries and their newfound investment in Afghanistan is also going to spell trouble for India?
Yeah, so you're absolutely right. I think we just heard from the Indian representative at the UN. India has projects in each of the 31 provinces in Afghanistan, which tells you, and we're talking of multiple billions of dollars that have been invested over the last 20 years. So I suppose when you look back, the question can certainly be asked, who was underwriting these investments in infrastructure, in the way of life? We ultimately put all our eggs in the NATO, US international forces that were there. It was pointed out that we aren't a direct neighbor of Afghanistan. That's absolutely true. But unlike in the 1990s and earlier, why did we not open up some sort of a parallel channel with Iran, Russia, Central Asia in a more active way? Had we done so, we would have probably had a slightly better hand. But having said that, it's never too late to start looking at the other non-Pakistan neighbors who also have a very strong interest in safeguarding some sort of a stable Afghanistan. I think your point is Pakistan, China, of course, moves in Afghanistan or looks at Pakistan army as its main sort of channel of influencing events. But I think we have to separate the two. I don't think China also relishes and Afghanistan just completely explodes. So here, I think Pakistan is the key player that somehow under the threat of sanctions or some sort of leverage, which I think the international community together, the United States, China, and the major powers have to put if they want some sort of a stable transition government. From what we've seen today at the United Nations, it doesn't seem so, and the events of the last 24 hours, I think the Western powers have more or less abdicated that role and are now relying on Pakistani intelligence agencies practically to keep to their word and not sort of embarrass their Western sponsors. So India has a difficult hand. I suppose the advantage is that you aren't contiguous, so you can sort of wait and watch, as Professor Chelani said. But ultimately, I think you're going to have to now look at the region beyond just America's eyes. I think we took the ball off. I think we can certainly strengthen our position in Central Asia. Tajikistan is a very important strategic neighbor of Afghanistan. We initially had options many years ago of possibly a forward military base with collaboration with Russia. Iran has enormous stakes in a stable Afghanistan. I think those are the countries to watch out for, because the alternatives, as we've seen, are frankly Rawalpindi, which is not a promising prospect for us.
Correct. Lieutenant General Atta Hasnain, I want to come to you now. From a security point of view, how concerned would you be, or should India's security apparatus be concerned?
See, Sanket, it's tempting to start by saying this is not 1989 and that there is no automatic possibility that 30 years down the chain, we are not far better prepared. Our security grid is much better. We have more troops on ground and we have the experience of handling all this. Having said all that, I agree with Mr. Brahmachalani that despite your preparedness, your capability and everything, the Pakistani propensity to be able to find loopholes and to be able to play the game, this is a part of the new great game, play this game as per their reckoning, to their advantage, taking advantage of the leverages that they enjoy with the Taliban, the fact that the Taliban will be hugely dependent on them at this moment for all kinds of outreach to the international community, etc. There is always the possibility that the aspect of ideology, and which is what we are expecting it to happen in Afghanistan, probably the gravitation of terrorists back to Afghanistan, the possibility of safe havens, the possibility of narcotics being used and things like that. All this region is going to become a mishmash of all that. The ISI, Pakistan's frontline agency, is adept at this. They've got the experience of years behind them. They are the ones who are playing the information warfare game at the moment on behalf of the Taliban, all the kind of projections which are being put out to the world. We're keeping all this in mind, the possibility of something being triggered, instigated from the Pakistani side for their interests to keep the ball rolling in Kashmir is always a possibility. Last 2 years, we have had some gains in Kashmir, substantial gains, I'll say. It will be difficult to do it, but considering the fact that they have all the leverages with them, it is possible that they can start this game, if nothing else, this game all over again.
Okay, Suhasini is also with us. Welcome, Suhasini Haider, National Editor and Diplomatic Affairs Editor of The Hindu. But I would like to first come to you, Ms. Meera Shankar. You know, if you were to do a SWOT analysis of this situation, what really do you think, as far as India is concerned, could be our, strengths and big opportunities here? I mean, I understand threats and I understand the weakness, but...
I'm sorry, I didn't hear your question properly.
Yeah, Ms. Meera Shankar, my question is that we've all been speaking about what could potentially be the threat or the weakness here or the vulnerability here as far as the situation or the Taliban hostile takeover or terror takeover, as Brahmachalani is saying. But could India diplomatically look at some sort of an opportunity here, or is there anything which is a position of strength or a point of strength for us to build on?
Well, I think the position of strength is that you have a great deal of popularity with the Afghan people. You know, polls by BBC have shown in the past that 70% of Afghans or more have a very positive opinion of India, and there's a great deal of affection for India. The second is that you actually have contributed to development in Afghanistan in a very major way. And I'm sure that the Taliban also is not looking to really mire Afghanistan in non-development. I'm sure that they would want to have some development as well. Now, the question is, what can the international community do? You have a situation which is a bit different from the, September 2001 situation, where actually you had Russia, Iran and India backing the Northern Alliance. Now, the Northern Alliance as it existed then doesn't exist. And in the meanwhile, Russia and Iran, to some extent, have shifted positions. Russia has been backing, to some extent, along with China and Pakistan a Taliban, a deal with the Taliban. So the kind of situation that prevailed then doesn't prevail now, and those kind of options perhaps are not so easy. Secondly, I think that Iran's position is a bit more nuanced in the sense that it did have Taliban, host Taliban fighters in Iran, but it was more to do with getting the Americans out of Afghanistan, from which Iran felt threatened. But Iran also feels threatened in the long run with a purely Taliban government, which would be non-inclusive or which would not embrace the minorities. The Central Asian countries would have similar concerns because a lot of them have grappled with the issue of extremism, with the issue of radicalization, and with the issue of drugs. So many of them would have similar concerns. Then if you go to the Gulf, if you remember in the 90s, the big supporters of the Taliban were Pakistan. These were the only 3 countries which had recognized it. And this was, Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, and UAE. These were the 3 countries which had recognized Taliban.
Correct.
Today, perhaps Pakistan and China are more willing to move ahead.
Absolutely.
But I think the UAE and Saudi Arabia have concerns because they have espoused more moderate policies. They have also opened up, at least the UAE.
No, while that may be correct,
so they
Ms.
may
Meera
not.
Shankar, while that may be correct, see, the problem is that
So what India
you've got
has to do,
Yeah.
look, let me finish, please. I think what India has to do is to try and network with all these countries.
Okay.
Otherwise, our options are very limited. We are not a contiguous neighbor of Afghanistan. We don't have connectivity. The connectivity that we were building through Chabahar has not moved fast enough.
Sure.
It's been sporadic, our efforts to build, and we don't have connectivity through Pakistan. So we are at best a marginal player. I think we have to wait and see how the situation unfolds.
Okay.
What kind of policies does the Taliban adopt? Do they agree to now negotiate and bring in minorities and have a kind of more representative government? Or are they going to just
it'll be a bit of a wait and watch.
By force?
That's an important point that you're making. That will they exercise the same sort of force and stand by the principles of the very same Taliban they were built on? So, Asni Haider, do you think engaging with Taliban, Indian engagement with Taliban in terms of talks and negotiation, is going to help? Because it's the manner in which they have taken over, barged into studios, announced this new Emirate of Afghanistan, the terrible story that we are hearing of women being told in the Herat University that please don't come to the university anymore. Is there any logic in engaging with them?
Look, there's a difference between engagement and recognition.
Yeah.
In terms of recognition, I think it's a very difficult decision for India to take because the truth is we have nothing in common with this government. It stands for everything that India doesn't. It has been responsible for allowing terror attacks against India. It has created safe spaces alongside these anti-Indian terror groups. It doesn't believe in democracy. It doesn't believe in holding up all the gains of women, Afghan minorities, the freedoms they've received in the last few years. In terms of recognition, it's a very difficult order. But I will say that had you asked me this question 2 days ago, I might have had a different answer. Given that the Taliban and have overtaken everything else, given that the Taliban is in power at a time when Indian citizens are in Afghanistan, our Indian embassy is still there, officials are there as well as other and Indian nationals, as well as India's so many hundreds of citizens who could suffer reprisals. India has as partners for India today, and the minorities as well, the Hindu and Sikh
Well, we seem to be losing your audio connection, Suhasini. We're going to fix this and maybe carry this discussion forward later. But there's a bit of an issue with her audio connection, and we've also unfortunately run out of time. Thank you very much to all of you. All news continues on the other side. Stay with us.